one nice little touch. Okay, our opponent is trying to flag, but a noble attempt. If black plays e6, okay, ask yourself, what is the fastest checkmate in that position? Okay, because a lot of you automatically take the pawn and allow the king forward. Your instinct should be to seal off the escape route. That should actually be your instinct, not sending the king toward the center, because that can be very inefficient. Welcome, people on YouTube, to a candidate's speedrun. I'm in the candidate's mood, so it's been a long day of commentating, so this might be a slightly lower energy speedrun, but I'm going to try to keep up the high level of instruction, and hopefully we'll get some pretty good games in. Let's go. I'm kind of in the mood for 5-minute chess just for this particular speedrun. Again, my intention is never to compromise, but remember that my blitz rating is slightly higher because I originally planned to do a 5-minute speedrun all the way and then kind of switch to the 10-minute time control. But the added bonus is that we can get a couple of higher rated games in. Maybe people will like that, and we're facing e4, b6. Remember that with these blitz games, I'm playing faster. I'm explaining a little bit less during the game. But then after the game, I'm trying to kind of fill in the gaps. Now, those of you who've watched the speedrun more assiduously might remember that my recommendation here, not my recommendation, Stockfish's recommendation, is to start with bishop d3. And we're facing the Hippo. When people go b6, they can play this in the kind of Owen's defense way, which is e6, or they can play the Hippo, and then it doesn't really matter if they start with b6 or g6. And against the Hippo, which we faced a surprising number of times, I recommend basically the same setup with both colors, where instead of just developing the knight to c3, you actually put a pawn on c3 in order to blunt this bishop, and then there's kind of a variety of ways to complete your development. But my preferred way is either to bring this bishop out to g5, or the move that I think I've been playing, knight b to d2. And eventually this knight is shuffled around to g3, but we don't need to rush with that. We can start with some kind of basic improving moves just to test the waters and see where our opponent is going to position their pieces. Let's start with the move queen e2. Just kind of building this battery. Potentially we might choose to trade light squared bishops and create some weaknesses on the queen side. This is a classic positional idea. But it's also good to have the queen in the center like this. e5. So our opponent is playing kind of a weird hybrid. Not a terrible line, actually, by our opponent, but very, very dubious, because our opponent is delaying their kingside development, and we shouldn't be looking for a crushing blow here. In fact, I think we should play this positionally. And in fact, the idea that I just mentioned, it's a perfect time to carry it out because we might not get another chance. So those of you watching, you might be familiar with this idea on the other side of the board. So you might be like, well, why aren't we trying to trade off this bishop? But the underlying concept is basically the same. Of course, black's king is not in question here. Instead, we're trying to provoke weaknesses on the light squares on the queen side, which is not a particularly deep positional idea. This is a very strange move. I think it just blunders a pawn. It also exposes the king via this diagonal. I don't see why we can't just take. I really don't see a reason we can't take twice on e5. There is a hidden tactical finesse if black tries to go knight takes c4. There's several ways that we can refute that, so let's see what our opponent has in mind. Might be a mouse slip, by the way. Sometimes you click on the square and the wrong piece goes to that square. This would be much more reasonable. Queen to d6, hitting our knight. Okay. Again, there's a million ways here that we could respond to this threat, but let's try to squeeze the most out of this position. I can kind of sense that we're very close to winning the game if we play accurately. The conservative approach here would just be to go knight e back to f3. And there's nothing wrong with that move. I think in a bullet game, I would play knight e f3. But if we want to play for the initiative, we want to try to play with tempo and exploit the fact that the king remains in the center for the time being without getting too crazy. At the same time, there's no easy way to do that because the tempting move a lot of you are suggesting is knight d to c4. But the queen is just going to slide up to e6. And oddly enough, this knight construction is not to my liking. So I'm actually going to go for the conservative in quotes, because actually I think this is a very, very venomous move, and hopefully the course of the game is going to prove that. Okay, so here we can go e5. Our opponent probably intends queen e6. And the point of e5 is actually not to win the knight. it's to provoke the move queen e6 because I think the queen on e6 is going to be vulnerable to a knight jump either to d4 or to g5. So first of all, I think our opponent might have missed this move and kind of gets lucky that this tactical defense even exists. What is going to be our response to queen e6? We're going to castle kingside, reinforcing the threat against the knight, forcing the knight to move. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit here. Now, the basic idea is that it may seem that we're losing this pawn, but we can defend it tactically with the move rook e1. This is why I tried to force the queen onto e6. If black would have captured on e5, this, again, would have triggered many different ways that we could have won a piece on the e-file. Now, of course, we follow through on our main idea and put the knight on d4. The queen chase begins. And what you will find is that this knight from d2, it's been sitting there ever since we developed it to that square. It can now come out to f3. And there's kind of these octopus-like movements of the knights that you should pay attention to, right? One knight moves out of the way. The second knight moves in. What is the purpose of that move? Well, first of all, we're opening up the bishop. We're protecting the e5 pawn. And we're playing against black's queen. Knight c5, good move. Let's move the queen back to c4. Why c4? I think because in the future, we might want to go b4 to chase this knight out of c5. And I'm kind of aiming at the c7 pawn. I'm also aiming at the f7 pawn. Am I worried about this lateral pin? No, because this knight on d4 is completely unassailable. It can't really be attacked by a pawn. And it might be a moot point because our next move is very likely h3 to attack the queen. Another idea that is on my radar is at the right moment to push e6. This is very common, just a very common concept. Let's go h3 to open up our opponent's kingside, and it's another reason why I put the queen on c4. At the same time, this pawn on e5 is a huge strength because it clamps down on a lot of these dark squares, so we shouldn't rush with the move e6. In this position, e6 might be good, but we have much simpler ways to play given our time deficit. Let's go bishop g5, pinning the knight. And now that our pieces are coming out to perfect squares, we're very close to just squashing our opponent like a bug. If you're in time pressure in a situation like this, it's good to have certain moves in your pocket. For example, I'm making a mental note, like if I don't know what to do, one very good move would be to play rook 8 at e1. But because our opponent put the rook f on e8, this is a tactical blunder. We can win material. I won't make a move until somebody from the Twitch chat points this out. And watching on YouTube, don't get nervous. I'm completely in control of the clock, I promise. What should we do here? How do we win material? Yes, we play bishop takes e7, and then knight c6. Very concrete idea, because we give up our very powerful bishop, but in return, we fork the two rooks. Yeah, and the game is basically over. We're winning an exchange, and then we're going to push the knight out of c5, and we're going to bring the other rook to d1. So I'm constantly noting potential moves that we could make quickly, right? That's one secret ingredient to playing fast. Like, okay, I've already understood that likely, once I pick up the rook, I'm going to bring the rook to d1, completing the mobilization of our towers. In my pocket, I've got several easy moves that I could make. b4 is one of them. This knight on f3, right? I'm looking at this knight and I'm saying, well, how could I maximize it? Because I'm not too worried about protecting the e5 pawn anymore. So I'm looking around the board, where could I put this knight? And I'm seeing the c6 square, very juicy square. That square could kind of be a base of operations. Getting our knight to c6 is not very difficult. So let's go knight d4. Trade would be right in our playing into our hands because it would help us connect the pawns. And otherwise, we're aiming for c6 with our knight. Notice that we've been reaping the benefits of this eighth move for a very long time. This walks right into our plan. I'm noticing the lateral pin against the knight. I'm asking myself, are there any actual threats that the knight is posing? The answer is no. The only way that it would threaten us is if it combined with a queen. But the g4 square is protected. And now, instead of rushing to take the knight, we pause for a second and say, okay, is there a better move? The answer is yes. We can fork the king and the queen, and our knight is the hero of the game. And it's over. Black is losing everything. Queen takes f7, intermezzo. Don't get fancy here, right? Maybe some of you are like, oh, queen e8 is mate. It's actually not mate, because takes bishop f8, and there you actually might flag. So a better idea is to deliver the simpler mate. GG. Okay, I think this was a good introduction to sort of basic positional thinking, because we face the Hippo once again. Now, I'm not going to rehash the merits of this c3 d4 setup. I've done that plenty of times. Remember that for those who are hesitant to put the knight on d2, this is not the kind of opening where all of the pieces need to come out right away. It's okay for one of your pieces to be blocked for a certain amount of time. The knight on d2 can always move out of the way around to g3 or up to c4. In the actual game, this knight was on d2 for 10 more moves, and then it moved up to f3. So one move that you should kind of understand is queen e2. Queen e2 is a great move in these types of setups. Reinforces the center and prepares this positional trade. e5 by our opponent. Probably the more Hippo-like way to play would have been e6. And here we can complete the knight maneuver to g3. We can also play bishop a6. There's lots of options. But our opponent played e5 and bishop a6. Why did I rush with this move? Because if we had instead castled, black can prevent this idea by playing a6. And it's not like we lose. Like, white is better here, of course. For instance, we could deploy our knight to c4 and put pressure on this pawn. It's hard for black to develop. Black is cramped. We could bring the rook to d1. But I figured we'd pounce on this opportunity while it existed. So what are the benefits of trading? Well, again, it creates these big holes on the queen side. And you'll see in a lot of positional openings like the London system, players try to avoid this type of scenario. So for example, in the London system, if you're a King's Indian player, which we are in the speedrun, in one of the main lines of the London, and the line I'm showing you, this is not what I'm recommending from the black side as a London antidote, but just for the sake of illustration. Okay, let's say white plays bishop d3, which is not great, but whatever. We could get a position like this. This is a very, very common type of position that arises out of the London system. And one thing that you often see is either white tries to go bishop a6, and the reaction you often see from players is actually to keep the bishop on the board, precisely for this type of reason, that they don't want to create these long-term light square weaknesses, and you could even get a repetition like this. The other way that you see people fighting this is they actually put a pawn on a6, much like our opponent could have done. So in this version, black really, really suffers in the long run. Of course, our opponent immediately exacerbated the problem with knight df6. Probably this was a mouse slip, would be my guess. But in response to knight gf6, we would have castled. Our opponent presumably would have castled. And here, a great way to continue the game would be either to play rook to d1, but even rook to e1, which looks a little bit dumb because, like, why are you putting a rook on a closed file? Well, remember, eventually we do need to move this knight out of d2, and this opens up the path for the knight to reach the g3 square. What is a good way that we could reinforce the queenside pressure? What kind of plan or idea do you see that would harass black even further on the queen side? Yeah, this is a very common idea. Like, I'm not even going to show any model games because it's not a... It's a common across almost all openings. Yeah, exactly. So you could continue with a4, a5. You could continue with a4, a5. Give me just one moment, guys. Sorry about that. Okay, so as many of you indicated, the correct answer is a4. Kind of a typical probing pawn attack, trying to provoke more weaknesses. I'd also draw your attention to the fact that the knight on d7 is actually nicely restricted by this pawn on d4. So this relationship is kind of important to observe. So moves like rook e1, when you hit 1500, these types of more defensive moves, you should begin to really appreciate the value of. Some pieces are doing the attacking, like the queen. Some pieces are doing the reinforcing. And that pieces that reinforce other pieces are equally valuable. How would you handle this with black? I would probably try to get this queen off of a6. And we would probably oblige... I wouldn't trade queens here because we have the space advantage. We have the nice center. I would probably park the queen somewhere on c4, d3. And white is a very pleasant position. So once our opponent blundered the pawn, the only tactical detail here was that knight takes e4 loses to several different things. The simplest, I think, is just takes, and this should be automatic for you at this level, queen b5 with a fork. Alternatively, queen to a4. You have two different ways to fork using the same diagonal. Or even queen b5 first, and then knight takes e4. So this is out of the question. And we drop the knight back to f3. If you run this on the engine, yeah, probably there's a better move here. I'm not even going to do that. Maybe queen b5 check. But the tempo move isn't always the good one. right? This is a good takeaway. Like, this position I thought was a little bit awkward because these knights are stuck in mud. And this knight on c4, where is it going? Like, it's kind of, its potential is very limited. And while we could probably force the queen trade with queen b5 check, I mean, black can maybe move the king over, but that seems really dangerous. Like, black would probably go here. I don't know. I wasn't in the mood to play like a long endgame. I wanted to keep the queens on the board. So for that reason, we just dropped the knight back to f3. Nothing wrong with a simple move. Nothing wrong with the simple move. e5 and rook e1, making sure that the pawn is untouchable. Knight d4 obviously takes on e5 is just out of the question for many reasons. Even f4 actually works. Even f4 actually works because here there's a check on d4 and you can just slide the king over to f1. So even the quote-unquote falling into the trap works out, but queen b5 is the clinical move. And here there's a million different wins. Rook e5, knight f3, knight c4, choose your pick. So this is not something you should be afraid of. Once we got our knights to ideal squares, dropped our queen back, pushed our opponent's queen away, and pinned the knight, the game is essentially over. Black is just completely tied up. Probably rook d to e8 would be more resilient, but here we could choose between a move like e6, b4, we could park a bishop on f6, maybe try to give Lolly's mate. When I say Lolly's mate, I'm referring to like the queen on h6 and the pawn on f6. So this is already essentially hopeless, but the tactic, the cherry on top, was this ability to think concretely. Don't fall in love with a particular piece. Every piece can be given away for the greater good. This is an important rule. The most famous example of this is the Fischer-Petrosian game, where this is like the most commonly cited example of a player giving away seemingly their best piece, but in reality, there was a very obvious... I think it's an overrated game. And I think it's presented in this way, like, oh, Bobby Fischer played this insane move that nobody understood at the time. But in reality, if you look carefully at this move, it's very logical. At this point, your curiosity is probably peaked, so let me find the game. Fischer versus Petrosian from their 1971 candidates match. Okay, so this is the position, and it's black to move just a moment. So Petrosian plays bishop to d7 here. And just for some context, okay, white is much better. Like, white is dominating positionally. Does anybody know what Fischer played here? Like, what move sends some ripples around the chess world kind of thing? Yeah, so if you look at this from a piece placement perspective, you're like, well, the knight's the best piece on the board. But Fischer played knight takes d7. And he gives up his really good knight for black's seemingly bad bishop. This is the top engine move. But if you look more carefully, the move makes perfect sense because his follow-up move shows us exactly why he did it. In reality, the best piece on the board is not the knight, but the bishop on d3, which is dominating the whole board. So he's getting a good bishop versus terrible knight situation, and he's getting control of the c file, so now he controls both open files, and he's threatening to surround this a6 pawn with rook c6. So Petrosian just gets crushed here. I won't show the rest of the game. You can find it yourself. Essentially, the point is never to fall in love with a particular piece. Let's go on, play one more game. One more 5-minute. We have white again against no name with a bunch of numbers. Okay, again, we're facing a fianchetto, this time king's... Okay, d5. So this is not a move that is typically studied or mentioned. It's not really a theory. It's not a terrible move. It's some sort of a deferred Scandi. But typically the Scandi and the king's fianchetto don't really go well together because black falls behind in development and falls behind in space. And there's two ways to play this position. You could push e5 and get kind of a French Caro-Kann structure, which I don't like as much. I prefer open center position. So let's take and get the Scandi. Thank you, Bangtown, California, for the 5 subs. Okay, now you should follow your basic principles, knight c3, just like in the Scandinavian. And our opponent is digging themselves into a major hole early on. This is a really bad move. It blocks the bishop. It encourages us to increase our development advantage. And here actually is an interesting moment. Ask yourself, how would you block this check? Like, what is your intuition? Now, I think there are several moves which are approximately equivalent, but there is one move that I'm going to play, which to my understanding is probably not on everyone's radar. I think most people want to go bishop e2, but I'm actually going to go bishop e3. And I'll explain why in more detail after the game. In short, I'm already thinking about where I want to castle. I'm already thinking about where I want to castle. And bishop e3 is a move that supercharges our path to castling queenside. Why do I want to castle queenside? Two main reasons. The first is that we're going to have a lead in development, and that lead in development can be converted into a direct kingside attack. So I'm anticipating that black's going to go knight f6 and castles kingside, and what I want to do is build up this queen-bishop battery just like in the previous game and set up a kingside attack. So because I think we're probably going to be attacking on the king side, I want to castle to the queen side. And I don't want to pretend like I'm some Nostradamus figure, but I think this is likely to take place, so let's go queen to d2. Again, bending the rules a little bit. I'm not like religiously developing, but at the same time I am developing. This counts. I'm developing my king. Here we can go knight f3, but I'm going to follow through on my concept and castle queenside. I'm anticipating our opponent castles kingside, and at that point we can play bishop h6. There's nothing wrong with that move, but we also don't really have to rush it because at this point we have two big priorities. We want to jumpstart our attack on the king side, but we haven't developed our king side yet. So I'm going to take the middle ground and I'm going to start with knight f3. You might be like, well, but doesn't this give black the time to either prevent bishop h6 or maybe move this rook? And well, first of all, neither actually ends up happening. But as I'll show you after the game, our development lead is so large and the queen is so bad that it's like we can win this game in a variety of ways. Bishop h6 is not the only problem that faces black. So here again, there's many ways that we can start the attack, and bishop h6 is just one option. Another option, as many of you are indicating, is h4. Although h4 meets with h5 often, and then you're at a standstill, so I don't like starting with h4. Let's go bishop h6 kind of as we planned. And here, another important moment. I don't have time to focus on all the subtleties here. We're running short of time. But the bottom line is you don't automatically have to take on g7 in these situations. In this position, I will take on g7, but something to remember if you're a newer player is that you can keep this tension and drive the pawn up to h5, and that can be much more effective because it keeps the black h-pawn prisoner. Now we've traded bishops, which guarantees the black will have problems with their king for a very long time. But that doesn't mean we have to restrict our play to the king side. We can also play in the center. We can play against black's queen, and that's precisely what I'm going to embark on now. I'm going to use the center of the board and try to maximize my minor piece activity, knight e5 to start, preparing to deploy the bishop to c4. And while I'm keeping an eye on black's king, that's not the only theater of action here. Knight a6, no reason not to complete our development. And at this point, the queen doesn't have a lot of options. I'm anticipating queen d6. That's probably the only reasonable move here for black. And yeah. And here again, there's going to be a million ways that we could play this position. But sometimes a well-placed slow move can really be worth 1,000 words. And that's exactly the kind of move I'm about to make. I'm looking at this knight and I'm saying, okay, well, where is it going? Well, it's going to b4, but is it actually going to b4? Because if black plays the move knight b4, I'm noticing that it walks into the x-ray and allows knight b5. So the move I'm going to play is f3. I faked you guys out. A lot of you were sure it was a3. f3 blunts the bishop, and it's just a really nice move because it also blunts the knight, and now we're basically ready to run our h-pawn up the board and give checkmate, which is going to be our next step. I'm kind of anticipating that our opponent gets panicky and plays knight b4. Some other things that I'm keeping track of, knight b5 could end up trapping the queen under certain circumstances. So particularly if we do end up playing a3, but okay, forget about that. c6 doesn't change anything. Let's go h4. And there comes a point in every attack where you're basically pressing the gas pedal down. And that moment has arrived. And what that really means is there comes a point in the attack when it's so overwhelming that you basically just start sacking pieces without even really calculating. So here, you might think that that translates to rook takes h5, but that's not the most accurate move. I think g4 is much more straightforward. Our ultimate goal here is to get the queen to h6. That will trigger very quick checkmate. To do that, we need the services of our rook. So sacking it on h5 is a little bit unwise. And, well, what if... Okay, and queen h6. Our opponent makes it very easy for us. And now the final step, but a very important step. We need to deflect this knight. And there is a lot of tactical material in chess literature that centers on this particular type of deflection. A lot of typical tactical ideas. The most common way of doing it is with another knight. There are many winning moves like g5, but the most clinical way of doing it is with another knight, in this case, knight e4. This also has the benefit of hitting the queen, among other things. Yes, there are other winning moves. There's knight takes g6. There is g5, although that's less clean because of knight h5. People mess up in this situation all the time. I will show you a couple of thematic games to enhance your understanding of this afterward. I'll show you why it's more clinical. This is the fastest path to checkmate. It's basically either forced mate or black loses all their pieces. Karpov Korchnoi is going to be the first game I show in the Dragon, because that's the best illustration, I think. And most people haven't heard of it. They've heard of Karpov, they heard of Korchnoi, but they're like, which Karpov Korchnoi game are you going to show me? Okay, he goes, oops, oh my gosh, I mouse slipped. But it doesn't change anything. I'm still totally winning. I had made in 2 moves, of course, bishop f7 and knight g6, but somehow it... Okay, now I'm going to have to focus for a second at 15 seconds. But not to worry, we're still so winning that I'm going to mate in a couple moves. No worries at all. Luckily, the mouse slip was a very innocuous one. We're just going to take all black's pieces and come back to h6. One nice touch. Okay, I don't care, whatever. Go away. One nice little touch. Okay, our opponent is trying to flag, but a noble attempt. If black plays e6, okay, ask yourself, what is the fastest checkmate in that position? Okay, because a lot of you automatically take the pawn and allow the king forward. Your instinct should be to seal off the escape route. That should actually be your instinct, not sending the king toward the center, because that can be very inefficient. Now we can pre-move queen h7 mate. So it's nice to give a check, but it's not always the best path forward, if that makes sense. Okay, so yeah, disaster averted. Okay, so let me start from the end here and show you the Karpov Korchnoi game. This is one of their earlier games. Karpov was like 21. Korchnoi was a little older, but this is their candidates match. This came from a Dragon, Sicilian, as you can probably guess. And in this position, it's white to play. So what's going on here? You can see the similarities. It's the same type of construction. You have this situation where if you can deflect the knight, it's basically checkmate. And it's actually much harder than it seems to find a clean way of deflecting this knight. So what are the various attempts here? Well, the first move that a lot of you might see is, well, let's go knight d5. But oftentimes, you can't just like tunnel vision a move like this. You have to understand the context. And knight d5 here is probably bad because, well, first of all, you can play rook takes d5, but rook takes c2 is the scary move. And I'm just trying to remember what the problem is after king b1. The problem is also that white isn't threatening anything here, or isn't threatening any forced checkmate. Let's check Stockfish. Yeah, queen b5. And this is a draw, actually, because this is the important thing for people to understand. First of all, this is not forced mate, and you just have a very messy position. But knight f6 is also not mate. And here white loses, because here the king escapes to e7. So sometimes it's not clean mate even if you deflect the knight, if the e-pawn shifts away, because then it opens up this escape route. So this is what Karpov is trying to avoid. Another typical theme, another typical way to deflect the knight is to play e5. You'll see this very, very often. And usually the point of this move is to open up a secondary square for the knight, like knight e4. This suffers from the same problem as knight d5. It doesn't really threaten anything. And black can also just eliminate the knight with a rook, and then launch his own attack, and the knight remains undeflected. Okay, so we're at a dead end. We tried the 2 direct attempts. We need to finesse this a little bit. Karpov finds a brilliant solution to this problem. Pause the video, see if you can figure... I mean, this is legitimately, I would say, a master level exercise. So what comes to mind? Does anybody know what he played? So he starts with a move that might be on your radar. Yeah, g5. He starts with g5. b4 was suggested. Black just takes. That doesn't do anything. Knight f4 is too slow. Yeah, rook d6, all of that is hope chess, g5. So black has to take with a rook, because if you move the knight to h5, and this is always something that you have to be careful about, I'm going to double check with the engine, but I'm pretty sure that Karpov goes knight f4. Yeah, knight f4, deflecting the knight. White threatens just to take on h5, so black has to go rook takes g5, and now rook d5 is crushing. Brilliant move, forcing the rook trade, and there's way too many threats here. There's like this threat, black has no attack, it's over. So Korchnoi is forced to play rook takes g5, and now the critical move. So you might say at first, oh, well, now you play knight d5. That's also wrong, because black can sacrifice the exchange. Again, the knight remains intact. What is the move here? It is rook d5, and this is the only winning sequence. Can't take with a knight because you get mated, that was the whole point. If you take with the rook, white plays knight takes d5, and how does this differ from playing knight d5 immediately? Now, here, black had this capture on c2, and you just got an incredibly messy position. What Karpov does is he eliminates the counterplay along the c file. Now his king is safe, and the attack storms through. Korchnoi plays rook e8. The game is not over. And now a second instructive moment. Do not go here. Again, this isn't mate. This is a complete dead end, and white isn't even better. Karpov plays a typical Karpov move, knight e4, bringing the other knight into the game. And after bishop c6, he plays the final brilliant move of the combination, e5. So directly attacking the knight, black obviously should take on e5. What is the point of his move? So a final question to people, what on earth is the point of e5? This is a brilliant final point of the combination. Legendary. This is not talked about enough. This is an incredible sequence of moves, honestly. I'll give you a second to think. Yeah, not knight takes e7. Not knight takes e7. That doesn't do anything. Just rook takes e7. The idea is, well, at least the cleanest mate is knight f6, e6, knight h5. And suddenly, and what I love about this combination, the mate actually happens on the g file, not the h file. So you do all of this to mate on the h file, and then suddenly you shift gears and deflect the pawn to mate on the g file. Maybe there are other ways to win. You can look that up. Korchnoi takes the other knight, or takes the knight. Karpov takes ef6, ef6, queen h7, king f8. And the second idea of the move e5 is that the e file is now open. Now you win with queen h8, and Korchnoi resigned, because after king e7, you go rook e... No, just kidding, you don't. You first take the bishop, deflecting the queen, and the final move is rook e1, pinning the rook to the king, and forcing black to give up either the queen or the rook. So that's a little introduction to h-file tactics for you. Yeah, so g5, rook d5, and then arguably the toughest part is actually this slow move involving the other knight, and then finding e5 is pretty incredible. Why couldn't he do this immediately, you might ask? Well, there's two reasons. First of all, black can give up the queen, and this is not just desperation. Black has plenty of material for the queen. There's a rook and a bishop and a pawn. This is a draw. So the point is to close off the fifth rank so that the queen doesn't have access to the h5 square. Also a check to g5. Now, it's pretty uncommon for this type of situation to occur where you have to, find all this trickery in order to mate on the h file. Much more often, you get a situation like this. Let me just see if I can find a very simple example of what typically happens. Typically, you don't have to deal with all this nonsense, and you have a much cleaner type of attack. Shura versus Lubojevic. All right, here's a nice simpler example. Still nice, but a little simpler. Also a dragon, because in the dragon, black fianchettos, so you often get this type of scenario. Okay, so this position. What would you do here with white? Now, again, a lot of you make the mistake of thinking g5 wins on the spot. It does not, because you allow the knight to slide into h5. And you can't just crash through with brute force. You're going to run out of pieces. You need to deflect the knight from f6, so the goal is the same. So at first you might say, well, I already know the trick, it's e5. But e5 works if black plays d takes e5. This works perfectly. But black will play queen takes e5. And if you now play knight e4, black will respond with a very cold-blooded, for example, rook fc8, And again, you reach the same problem where the king escapes through the center. So often in real games, you need to finesse the stem idea a little bit, which basically means oftentimes starting with kind of a different first move to set up the idea. So why does e5 fail? It fails because there's a queen on a5. So either we need to kick the queen away or we need to block it. F4 is too slow. F4 is too slow. Yeah, b4 is the clinical win, b4. Some of you are saying knight d5. The problem is you run out of pieces. You need that knight to put it on e4. So the move is b4. And now it works perfectly because the queen cannot stay on the diagonal. Queen e5, f4 traps the queen. Literally the queen is trapped. So the queen has to drop back. Queen a1 check doesn't actually change anything. Here, yeah, king d2, for example, or even knight b1. So Lubojevic dropped back to d8, and now it works perfectly. e5 and knight e4. Rook e8, and now one last finesse. Now it's time for g5. Now it's time for g5, because knight h5 runs into rook h5 and knight f6. And if you play knight takes e4, simply f takes e4, ed simply rook takes d4, and black resigns. Because black is checkmated. For instance, let's say he moves the queen, takes, check, check, and mate. So one of the takeaways here is that you rarely get like the absolute cleanest version of a tactic that you might see in a book. And part of the fun is applying it to a specific position and understanding, okay, how is this different from, the kind of the rudimentary example that I saw. This is one of my pet peeves with teaching in general. It's like, usually there's going to be, like when a concept is taught, the application in real life is not going to be as clean as when it's taught. So one last example. This has a slightly different twist. This is a slightly different twist, and then we will move on. Here we go. Not a famous game, but again, a dragon-type position. At this point, you kind of already know the drill. Here, the point is to decide between playing knight d5 immediately and playing the sequence that I've been kind of centering the lecture on, which is e5 and knight e4. Here, and I'm going to spare you the hard work, if you start with knight d5, black plays, actually it might be possible also, so maybe this is not a great example. Let me check with the engine. Just a moment. I'm going to see. Yeah, knight d5 is winning. Yeah, but okay, so both moves are winning in this case. What I wanted to illustrate is that in the game, black gives the check, white moves the king away. So actually this gets interesting. Apparently king f1 is a really bad move. Rook d8. So here's how the game concluded. Black moved the rook away. White pushes g5. And black plays the move knight h5, which loses the game to a very, very pretty tactical sequence, which is the reason I was showing this game in the first place. White to play and win. See if you can spot it. Rook h5, gh5, and knight f6. Boom. Unstoppable mate, Lolly's mate on g7. But apparently black is winning in this position with the move queen to a6, setting up the discover check against the king. So you might say, well, okay, what's the problem? The king moves away. Now black takes the knight, and amazingly, white's attack runs out of steam. Gf, ef, and you have no follow-up because, again, the king escapes. So ridiculously enough, the mistake that white made is to play king f1. And the cleanest winning move here is a brilliant move. What is the best way to continue here? I'm actually really happy we're looking at this. White to play and win. So the point is, can you prevent the rook from moving off of f8? Oh, the engine showed it, so you see it. It's b4. Playing with tempo. Queen takes b4, c3, and it's just a double attack. You're threatening knight f6, and you're attacking the queen, and black is out of checks. So either black has to move the rook and lose a full queen, or make another move and get checkmated, yeah, with knight f6. So boom, boom. Why can't I make the move? I don't know. It's glitching a little bit. Oh, there we go. Yeah, rook c3, knight f6, e6, queen h7. Yeah, so here is your daily tactical lecture. Hope that wasn't too long-winded. But I like to give some context. When we come across a theme that I think isn't really talked about enough, I like to give some real-life examples, especially because I think when you do this in like Puzzle Rush, you get like the easy version of it. And I like to show that it's not always as simple as, for instance, the instance that we had in my game. So in my game, it was very simple. You just go knight e4, boom, that's it, because the queen is hanging. And there's a bishop in the attack. So as for the game, there isn't much to discuss. The one thing to pay attention to is how I played bishop e3, setting up the quick castle queenside. And then the second big theme is that I basically combined play on the king side with play in the center. So some of you were worried about this. This is rarely a problem. You can drop back to d2, but the better move is queen h4. And you're threatening to win the game with knight g5. So this theme is usually not actually going to result in the loss of material. So we took on g7, and we stick the knight in the center, knight e5. Deploying the bishop, and one slow move can really make the position breathe. Notice that we weren't afraid of knight b4 because of knight b5. X-ray, and we pick up the knight. c6 is meaningless, and now we crash through with h4. h5 would have been met with g4. This is like the very typical attacking method, where you throw away all of your pawns in order to open all the files. I'm sure we'll get more chances to do this kind of thing in the future, so I won't delve too deep. And now h5. Giving up the bishop, but opening up the h-file. And at this point, you should know what the move would have been here. Here, the move would have still been knight e4. But after queen d7, okay, queen d7 gives up the queen, but queen to c7, last question for people. How would you proceed here with white? What do you believe is the most clinical way of finishing the attack? One more wrinkle to add to your understanding of this nuance. Do not take the knight because the queen laterally protects h7. I would not even play this because of rook f7. And suddenly, once the rook gets involved, it gets a little bit messy. I would play the slower move that just adds an attacker and overwhelms black's defenses on the king side. Yeah, my inclination would be to go knight to g5 first. Knight to g5. Yeah, and it occurred to me that black can actually maybe go e6, but this should not save the game. I mean, I want to get another game in, so I won't explore this too deeply. But even a slow approach, like doubling rooks on the h-file, should do the trick. Because it's going to set you up for some other beautiful combinations, like a queen sack with checkmate like this. The point is, you don't always need to attack by sacrificing, especially when your opponent is not creating any counter threats against your king. In the game, we didn't need to face any of this. Our opponent did everything for us. Obviously, I mouse slipped here, but this should have been the way that the game ended. Okay, one more game. There's a lot more that we could talk about here, but again, we're early in the speedrun. There's no reason that we need to try to do everything in one game. Let's get one more in. And we're facing kind of a typical scenario where people don't really... I mean, c3 is the only legitimate move here, the Smith-Morra. Our response there would be knight f6, declining the gambit. This is just like a bad version of the center game. And I think we've already faced it, so I'm not going to re-explain our opening strategy. We develop our knights first and foremost. And here, I'm pretty sure we reached this position in a previous speedrun game. And I played the move e6, which I think is the most effective way to punish white's opening choice. So the point of e6 is twofold. Of course, we're opening up the bishop. The ideal square would have been b4. But we're also preparing to expand in the center with d5. Before we play that, though, let's get our bishop out to c5. h3. So our opponent continues to dig themselves into a major hole without realizing it by falling behind in development. And at this point, all that we really need to figure out is what order are we going to make our moves in. Now, maybe some of you are tempted by queen b6, which is not a bad move, but I want to play this in more textbook fashion. The basic idea is we want to open up the center, and we want to very, very quickly catch white unawares before he gets a chance to consolidate on the king side. So I've kind of laid out the roadmap. Let's follow the roadmap. Let's start with d5. Once the trade happens, the e-file is open, and we want to get a rook to e8 as quickly as possible. Queen e2 check. Is this scary? Absolutely not. It helps us complete our development. And white is actually already completely lost. Knight f3. Finally, our opponent starts to develop, but it's too late. Now, a lot of you are probably very let's go d4. Let's Let's punish white. One iota of patience is going to go a very long way here. So just one move that completes your development is going to be the difference between a messy conversion and a very, very clean game. Perhaps even a miniature. Castles. There's no rush. D4 is not going anywhere, and our opponent just continues to dig themselves deeper and deeper into the hole. So here, what do we do? How do we respond to this scary-looking move? Several ways that we could treat this position. I'm actually going to think here for a second, try to be accurate. So many tempting moves here, like even bishop takes f2 is probably winning. Seriously, but why do we need to reinvent the wheel? I don't really see the point. The bishop is hanging. Let's move it. Straightforward chess is your first sort of instinct should be the straightforward move. If the straightforward move doesn't serve the needs of the position, then you start thinking, can I play this in a more fancy way? Now I'm noticing that the white queen on b5 is very restricted, and this is often going to be a byproduct of kind of shoddy opening play. You're going to start out with one goal in mind. Let's say you want to checkmate the king in the center. As a result of trying to very quickly develop their pieces, your opponent is going to create other problems. So you have to be flexible in terms of what your goal is. Now that I mentioned the queen, all of you should be kind of noting the move a6 and queen on a4. And I think here we have a forced win. What do I see when I look at this position? Well, what are the queen's escape routes? Well, the big escape route is through the fourth rank. So the correct move should already be kind of instinctive to you. We want to push d4, sealing off one escape route and incidentally sealing off the other one as well. So essentially, if we can find a way to attack the queen, it's going to be virtually game over. And luckily, there is a way to attack the queen. But let's try to be accurate. Let's start by delivering the check on a5 and pushing the pawn up to b5. This is the basic pattern. Yeah, knight d2. And we're probably not going to win the full queen, but we are going to win a minor piece and probably even more. Actually, if we want to be super accurate, so what am I grappling with here? b5, bishop takes b5, at least keeps the queen alive. If we want to win the full queen and we want to be pedantic, we can try to find a way to get the knight around to like c5 or b6. So I'm looking for a way to do that. The problem is if we go knight d7, white's going to go knight takes d4. So because we have 40 seconds, I'm just going to go b5. I'm not going to bother looking any further. We're just going to win the game. Win the piece. And once we win the piece, white's pieces are also totally paralyzed here. And here again, there's probably going to be some computer win, but I don't really see it. So we're just going to play simple chess. Let's go bishop d5. I took a little too long, so I'm going to have to play fast. We're going to bring the other bishop back to c7. And already I'm kind of developing a very quick roadmap for how I intend to win this quickly. Why did I bring the bishop here? Well, the main reason is I want to build this battery and checkmate white on the h2 square. Why do I want to checkmate on the h2 square when there's a knight defending that square? Because I'm seeing that there's going to be contact against that knight, and white's knight is not going to be able to stay on d2 forever. It's going to have to move out of the way eventually, and the moment it does, we'll be able to eliminate the only defender of the h2 square. This is kind of how my intuition is operating. Okay, well, our opponent does all of the hard work for us. So first of all, we can go h6 and just force the knight back. And that's exactly what I'm going to do, which I know is a shocking move to some of you. And now we're going to set up the bazooka. And now the final step. But we don't need to execute the final step in a rushed manner. Let's start by deploying the rook, further restricting white's pieces. White can't breathe at this point. And you should start thinking about ways in which you can essentially undo the Gordian's knot. How do you actually disarm both of these knights? Because taking on f3 is a bad idea. White's just going to recapture with the knight. One knight is going to replace the other, and we haven't gotten anywhere. You need to find a way to exchange both of these knights without disrupting the battery, and there is a move that accomplishes that, and that is knight e4. So really the point of rook e8 was to prepare knight e4. Knight e5, okay, so knight c4, that's a good move by our opponent. Let's go queen c5. Temporarily, the battery is disarmed, but we're going to rebuild it momentarily. And I'm just going to have to play really quickly here because I did let my clock go a little bit lower than I anticipated. So basically here, I'm combining two ideas. I'm keeping an eye out for the possibility to return to d6. But I'm also just bringing my pieces into the center. I'm spotting various maneuvers, and I'm like loading up the move even before my opponent plays his move, knight d5. This knight is coming around to f4, and I'm also kind of noticing the breakthrough d3, which just opens everything up, and eventually something is going to give. Our opponent is holding on really, really nicely, but eventually something's got to give. Okay, rook c1, that's a nothing move. We can go knight f4. And our next move is very, very likely to be d3. If I had more time, I'd start calculating tactics. Actually, knight takes g2 is a huge threat. Knight takes g2 is a huge threat. And we want to keep our bishop. Now, the knight has moved back from d2, which tells me queen d6 is now possible. I think our opponent's going to go c4, but at that point, there's a million ways we could win. Yeah, I have to give a lot of credit to our opponent. They've played really, really good defense, but finally we break it down. Check, and we'll be able to take this knight. I'm not checking in order to take the rook. I don't care about that. I'm still trying to execute the idea that I started with, which is to mate white on the h2 square. And finally we succeed. Apologies for that frantic finale, but I thought the first part of the game was important to explain my logic. So let's quickly run through this. I'm pretty tired. It's late, but just a quick summary of key moments. We're still, like, even when we play 5-minute chess, we're at the point where we are encountering non-theoretical responses to the Sicilian. And one of the common responses is this weird line. C3 is the Smith-Morag gambit. We would transition the game into the Alapin. I'm sure we'll face it. White can also play knight f3. And here, our response would be d6. And in 95% of cases, this just transitions into the knight-r. So this position is, other than that, there's nothing too exciting. When I said this is a bad version of the center game is an obscure response to e4, e5, where white plays d4 and now takes with the queen. Now, this actually contains some venom. Jan Nepomniachtchi has played this a lot. In Blitz, this is not such a dumb weapon. But against the Sicilian, it's a lot more toothless because your king is better protected. You have that e-pawn. And so we quickly get a development advantage. We push e6, and we're preparing central expansion as well as the rapid deployment of this bishop to b4 if it's allowed. And if it's not allowed, the second best square is c5 targeting f2. So our opponent just like neglects their development move after move. This is maybe the last chance for white to like quickly bring the kingside pieces out. But queen e2 is another mistake. And at this point, white is just too behind in development, I think, to save the game. Queen b5, simple chess, bishop back. All right, so here a lot of people would go wrong because you would be excited about this move. There's actually no good discovery in this position. All right, so particularly if you want to get better at blitz, like yeah, I would spend 15, 20 seconds, calculate maybe d4. I was like, yeah, this is very messy. Why would we go for this? If there is a perfectly simple move that satisfies the needs of the position, oftentimes it's just better to play it. Then we push a6, and here we basically switch, right? Originally, I wanted to go rook e8 and checkmate white. But the moment bishop d3 was played, I noticed that the queen is essentially out of squares. We push it to the side of the board, we identify its escape routes, and we seal them off. Then we basically identify ways that we could attack the queen efficiently. So I spotted this idea of b5, vacating the path for the pawn, and this move wins a bishop. Then we centralize, we bring the bishop back, building the battery, and rook fe8. Right? Moves like these you should kind of take note of. Small, simple moves that bring pieces into the game. If you're up a piece, there's no rush to convert quickly. A lot of people here would get too trigger happy and they would do something like this, like let's exchange the knights. At the end, white would simply play this move, which you've forgotten about, and you'd be like, well, why did I exchange all the pieces? Now white has better development. The win has gotten a lot harder. So don't go for these forcing sequences unless you're really sure that it leads to a successful result. There's nothing wrong with just sitting on the position with moves like these. Also, bishop b4, right? Just like continuing to tighten the screws, bring everything into the game, centralize the knight, and eventually the win is going to come to you. Eventually our opponent is going to crack. So this allows the decisive sequence. Knight e2 check, slicing off the connection between the queen and the knight. We eliminate the knight. We return to d6, and we checkmate white on h2. So a simple game, but I think a lot of instructive concepts there. And in the next speedrun, I might explore a little bit the theme of trapping the queen in the middle game, which is a really interesting concept. A lot of cool positions stem from that tactical theme. But let's end for now. I think that was enough for one day. Thanks everybody for watching. This was a late night speedrun, and I'll see you in the next one for those watching on YouTube.